First things first, the delay really was about trying to buy time and get some better economic news, not least on one of your specialist subjects, were you to do mastermind, interest rates.
Indeed, it seems that financial pressures on the government are still very tight, but they're easing. Two main reasons for that, Alistair. The first is that wholesale gas prices have been falling. They fell below €100 per megawatt hour this week, down from 350 euros per, so a huge drop in the summer. They're still double what they were sort of average over the last 10 years, but they're roughly where they were just before the war in Ukraine began in February. So a lower gas price means that it doesn't cost the government so much to deliver subsidised energy, that energy price cap. The other thing, government borrowing costs have come down from this time last week. They're about 4.2% a year on 10-year money for the government's borrowing, and that sort of ripples out across the economy, higher mortgage rates, higher personal loan rates. That 4.2, Alistair, now, I just looked before I came in for this conversation, it's just above 3.5. That is an enormous move, an enormous reduction in the interest rate paid on the debt by government of an advanced industrial economy like the UK. And that means that government debt interest payments are lower, you know, 10, 20 billion pounds lower. So the combination of hopefully a lower bill for the energy price cap and lower debt interest means that fiscal black hole you talked about, it's still wide, but it's not quite the chasm it was.
And it is, I mean, that's why it's called a budget, although it's an autumn statement. I mean, it is literally going down. I've got to spend this on health, education, the rest of it, and I've also got to spend this amount on servicing the national debt.
If it's a budget,
if that squeezes, you've got a wee bit more for something else.
If it's a budget or an autumn statement, that means two things. It's you have OBR forecasts that it's based on. That's the Office of Budget Responsibility. The OBR is now, doing its best to model the economy, getting their ducks in a row in terms of their forecasting. And it means that you present both sides of the ledger. You present the tax side of the ledger, the revenue raising side of the ledger of the national accounts, and you present the spending side of the ledger. Now, it may be that we don't see the full breakdown of departmental spending totals. It may be we just see the sort of envelope of overall government spending that will kick in from April next year.
Let's look importantly at the income side of that as well, because spending can be reduced and that helps balance the books, or you can increase income, raise taxes. Philip Bond, at the beginning of the programme, when we went on air at midday, I had a fascinating conversation with him, and he was saying what Sunak and Hunt do on things like personal allowances, the amount you and I and everybody else can earn before we pay tax, or drift into higher rates, and secondly on things like the triple lock, has huge economic significance, but it also tells us a lot about the political philosophy of Rishi Sunak.
Indeed. Is he a small state conservative, given that the tax share of the overall GDP is at a 70-year high? And what the mini budget wanted to do was reduce it by like half of a percentage point. It was actually a light touch on the tiller, even though it caused such turbulence on financial markets and such political turmoil as well as we've seen. But I think on those two subjects, the triple lock, will Sunak and his Chancellor Jeremy Hunt deliver that promise to raise the basic state pension from next April by either 2.5%, the average rate of earnings, which is about 5% increase, or the average rate of inflation, whichever is higher, 10.1%. If they do that for the 11.5 million pensioners, that's 16 billion quid right there, and we have to pay that forever because it's a permanent commitment. It may be, well, I don't reckon if they don't do the triple lock, I'm not sure that the government's own backbenchers will accept that. They may not vote through the budget.
We're back into manifesto territory.
Legislation, because they'd be going against the manifesto commitment. Remember how nuts a lot of Tory backbenchers went about Theresa May's dementia tax, right? And it's a similar thing. You don't mess with the grey vote. That's one of the sort of truisms of Tory politics.
If you're Rishi Sunak and you're just as our People's Poll shows here on GBNews, you're beginning the fight back, you're beginning to claw back some territory, but it's a hell of a long way to go. The last thing you do is shoot your core support, which I'm afraid is the Blue Ronce Brigade and pensioners.
That's right. So what I think will happen instead, and it brings me no pleasure to say this, and this is not inside knowledge, this is just the sort of surmise, piecing together fragments of conversations from lots of people in and around power. This is what we do, right?
Yeah.
This is journalism. I reckon he will go for higher taxes in some areas, maybe even on a windfall tax. We had a windfall tax from the government in March, of course, though a lot of the increase, the oil companies could fend it off. In fact, they invested more money in North Sea oil and gas development. Oil companies, they already pay 65% tax on their profits. They pay 30% corporation tax, an extra 10% supplement, and then a 25% windfall tax on top of that. That may go even higher. We shall see. But if we do that, that will be a reversal of the Rishi Sunak we saw when he was last Chancellor, the former Chancellor, back in March. So let's wait and see. But it's going to be, I think, in general, the fact that they've managed to shift the fiscal statement back from October to November and the markets haven't freaked out. In fact, the markets have welcomed it.
Sure.
That's all about the government saying we are now back in charge. We are now in control of the calendar and of events, and not the financial markets. Not, as we used to call them, Alistair, the gnomes of Zurich.
Indeed, indeed.